My man's got a heart like a rock cast in the sea.
Just outside Philadelphia, at the edge of the woods, there is a cemetery called Mount Lawn. And there is a place in it, an ordinary patch of grass, nothing to mark it, nothing to catch your eye, where, for 33 years, the greatest blues singer this country ever produced lay in the ground with no name above her. No stone, no dates, only grass. You have probably heard the story of how she died. Most people have. The story goes that she bled to death on a dark Mississippi road one September night in 1937 because a hospital for white people turned her away and would not treat a black woman, no matter how famous, no matter how badly she was hurt. It is a terrible story. It was printed in a magazine within weeks of her death. Years later, it was put on a stage in a play built around that very night. And it has been passed from one person to the next for generation after generation until it stopped sounding like a rumor and started sounding like history. I want to be careful with you here because this matters. That is the story that was told. It is not yet the story I am telling you is true. Tonight, I want to tell you the other one, the real one. It is quieter than the legend. There is no single villain in a doorway, no easy face to blame. And I will warn you now, my friend, in some ways, the truth is worse. So settle in and stay with me a while. Because underneath that missing headstone, underneath the story the whole country decided to tell about her, there is a woman, a real one. And there is a voice that came roaring out of a poor little girl on a street corner, far too big for the small body it lived in. A voice that never actually stopped. To understand why that grass stayed bare so long, and why the true story honors her more than the famous one ever could, we have to go back, past the fame, past the crown they placed on her, all the way back to a hollow in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and a child whose voice was already too large for the world she was born into. The hollow had a name. They called it Blue Goose Hollow, a cluster of shacks at the foot of Cameron Hill in the poorest corner of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it is where Bessie Smith was born, sometime around the year 1894. I say around because no one knows for certain. There was no birth certificate. Later in her life, one document would put it at 1894. A census taker had written down something closer to 1892, and the stone that would one day stand over her grave would carve a third year, 1895. 3 different years for one woman. That is how she came into the world. So far down at the bottom of things that no one thought to write down the day she arrived. Even her beginning went unrecorded. Her father was a man named William Smith, a laborer who preached part-time from a Baptist pulpit. He died while Bessie was still a baby, so early that she would never carry a single memory of his face. She was the youngest of 7 children, and by the time she was about 9 years old, her mother, Laura, was gone too. So were 2 of her brothers. What remained of the family held together the only way it could. An older sister named Viola took charge of the children, of the cooking, of survival itself. She took in other people's washing to keep them fed, boiling the clothes in great vats over a coal fire out in the open air. There was not much. Some days there was almost nothing at all. But there was a voice. Even then, even as a small girl in a hollow with holes worn through her shoes, Bessie Smith had a voice. And it did not sound like a child's voice at all. It came out of her full-grown and enormous, a sound far too big for the little body it lived in. The kind of sound that made grown men stop on the sidewalk and turn to see where it was coming from. So she took it where the money was, down on 9th Street, the loud, living heart of Black Chattanooga, all music and motion. Young Bessie would sing while her brother Andrew played guitar beside her, and passing people would drop coins for the girl with the impossible voice. Understand, this was not a hobby. It was not a sweet little thing a child did on a Sunday. It was work. It was how the family ate. Before she was old enough to understand what she had been given, that gift was already keeping the people she loved alive. We can only imagine what that does to a child. To learn so young that the thing inside you, the thing you were simply born with, is also the thing standing between your family and hunger. We cannot know how she felt out on that corner. No one wrote it down. But we know that she stood there, and we know the voice only grew, and slowly the wider world began to hear it. In 1909, while she was still just a girl, a newspaper printed the very first known notice of Bessie Smith, a reviewer who had caught her act on a stage down in Atlanta and thought her worth naming in print. The street corner had carried her as far as a street corner could. She was outgrowing Chattanooga the way she had outgrown that small body, from the inside, with a force that would not be contained. And then a traveling show came through town. It carried singers and dancers and comedians from one southern city to the next, and among them was the very person who would open the door to the rest of her life, her own brother. When that show rolled out of Chattanooga, the girl with the too big voice was going with it. The year was 1912. The show was a traveling revue run by a man named Moses Stokes, one of the black music and comedy troupes that pitched their tents in one southern town and rolled on to the next. Bessie's brother Clarence was already with them, a dancer who knew how to work a crowd. It was Clarence who got his little sister a chance to show what she could do. She was about 18. She got the job as a dancer. And here is something worth knowing. When Bessie joined that show, she did not need anyone to teach her how to sing. That had been hers since 9th Street. What she needed was everything else: how to hold a room, how to make a crowd of strangers belong to her. And on that circuit, she found the woman who could teach it. Her name was Gertrude Rainey, Ma Rainey, the mother of the blues, the biggest name a black woman could carry on a southern stage. There is a story about the two of them, told for 100 years, that Rainey kidnapped young Bessie and dragged her from town to town against her will. It is colorful. It is also not true. Rainey took the girl under her wing and taught her the trade, how to command a stage, how to survive a brutal business with her dignity whole. And then, the way the gifted always do, Bessie outgrew her teacher. For the better part of a decade she paid her dues. One tent show after another, one town after another, singing across the South and up the Eastern Seaboard until her name meant something on the circuit that booked black performers for black crowds. By the early 1920s, she was no one's understudy. She was a headliner. And then, in 1923, came the moment that changed the shape of American music. A company called Columbia brought her into a studio. The blues, it turned out, could sell. And Bessie cut a song called Downhearted Blues, written by two other blues women, Alberta Hunter and Lovey Austin. What happened next, no one was ready for. By the accounts that survive, the record sold something near 800,000 copies. At a time when a black woman's voice on a record was still new and risky, Bessie Smith sold a fortune. They gave her a title for it: the Empress of the Blues. Columbia put it on her, the papers repeated it, and it stuck. And soon she was the highest paid black entertainer in the country. Sit with that a moment. A girl born in a Chattanooga hollow, so far down that no one wrote the day of her birth, was now a woman the whole nation paid to hear. But notice who did the naming. That crown was placed on her by other people, a record company with a fortune to make from her, a press that liked the sound of a queen. It was theirs to give. And hold on to that thought, because the question of who gets to say what Bessie Smith was, who gets to write it down, who gets to carve it, will follow her clear past the end of her life. You could measure her success by the way she traveled, a private railroad car of her own, long enough to carry her whole company and every trunk they owned. It was more than a badge of how far she'd come. It was armor. Across the South she was crossing, the good hotels would not give a black performer a room, not for any number of records sold, not for any crown. So she brought her own roof with her and rolled into each town owing nothing to anyone. There was a hard dignity in that, a woman the whole country paid to hear, still carrying her own bed down the tracks because the country would not offer her one. By the middle of the 1920s, Bessie Smith was about as untouchable as a black woman could be in America, and she knew it. She had come up from nothing, on nothing but that voice, and she would apologize to no one for any part of it. Which is exactly where the full force of the woman, the fearlessness, the fire, and the trouble that came with both, comes into view. To understand what people meant when they called her fearless, start with the sound itself, because in 1925, they put the Empress of the Blues in a room with the man who was becoming the king of jazz. His name was Louis Armstrong, and his cornet was already bending the shape of American music. The two of them cut a handful of sides together that year, among them her version of St. Louis Blues, a recording people still reach for a century later. Picture what that room held, two of the most powerful instruments the country had yet produced, her voice and his horn, circling each other, neither one giving an inch. Bessie did not shrink beside Louis Armstrong. Nobody made Bessie Smith shrink. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, and she filled a stage the way her voice filled a hall, completely, with room to spare. Every word she sang landed clean and whole. You never lost a syllable. When she walked into a room, the room rearranged itself around her. And she lived the way she sang, big, without apology. There is a story from her touring days, and I will tell you plainly it comes down to us from a single account, from a niece who traveled with her, so hold it as a story more than a certified fact. The way it is told, a group of hooded Klansmen came one night to collapse the tent where Bessie was set to perform, hauling at the stakes to bring the whole thing down. And Bessie Smith walked straight out toward them. She did not send a man to handle it. She stood in front of those robes herself and cursed them until they turned and slipped off into the dark. Whether it happened exactly so, we cannot swear to, but everyone who knew her believed it could have, and that tells you something true about the woman even if we cannot verify the night, because that was the sense of her, that nobody messed with Bessie. Black or white, it made no difference. She drank hard, she loved hard. She took her pleasures with men and with women both, and offered no explanation to anyone who thought she owed one. She was a woman of enormous appetite for living, and she went at all of it the same way she went at those Klansmen. Head up, straight ahead. But a life lived that hard has weather in it too. Her marriage, to a man named Jack G., a night watchman she'd wed back in 1923, was a storm that never fully cleared. There was love in it, and there was fury, and the two were tangled together in a way that wore on them both for years. She was, in so many ways, the very thing she sang about, the wild joy and the deep trouble living in one enormous heart. And while she stood at the peak of all of it, the records, the crown, the railroad car, something was moving in the distance that no fortune and no fearlessness could face down. The world was changing underneath her. Radio was arriving in American homes, and it gave away for free the thing people had been paying Bessie to hear. Talking pictures were coming, pulling the crowds off the tent show circuit and into movie houses. The ground that had carried her to the top was beginning to shift. You can almost hear it coming in one of her own recordings. In 1929, she cut a song about being down and out, about how the friends who crowd around you when you're flush all vanish the moment the money does. She recorded it just weeks before the stock market fell off a cliff and took the whole country's fortune with it. She did not know what was bearing down on her when she sang it, but the song knew. It sat there waiting, like something written in advance. She had ridden the 1920s as high as anyone alive, but the decade was ending, and it was about to take nearly everything she had built with it. When the crash came, in the autumn of 1929, it did not fall gently on anyone, but it fell hard on the business that had made Bessie Smith rich. The records stopped selling. People with no money for bread had none for music, and the ones who did have a little now had a radio in the front room, giving away songs for free. The recording industry very nearly collapsed altogether, and a black woman singing the blues, the very sound that had defined the decade now ending, was suddenly a harder thing to sell than she had ever been. Columbia, the company that had crowned her, let her go. In 1931, they closed out the catalog of black artists she had been the jewel of, and the Empress of the Blues was without a label. The fortune she had earned did not stay, and the private railroad car, that long, proud roof she had carried across the segregated South, she had to sell it. Picture that. The very symbol of everything she'd climbed to, sold off to keep going. You can measure how far the ground had dropped in a single number. In 1933, she went back into a studio for what would turn out to be the last time. 4 songs for a company called OK, arranged by a young man named John Hammond. Remember that name. Hold on to it because it comes back before this story is through. For those 4 final recordings, Bessie Smith was paid about $37.50 apiece. The woman who had once sold near 1 million records now cut her last 4 sides for the price of a week's groceries. And here is where I have to stop you, my friend. Because if you are bracing yourself for the part where the great Bessie Smith fades into a forgotten, penniless nobody, that is not what happened. That is not who she was at the end. She kept working. She was too much of a force to sit still and be pitied. When the music changed, when the raw blues gave way to the smoother, swinging sound coming up behind it, she changed with it, reaching for new songs, new arrangements, a new way of meeting the moment. In 1935, she played the Apollo up in Harlem. In 1936, she stepped into a show at a club called Connie's Inn, taking over from a young singer named Billie Holiday. A singer, by the way, who had grown up worshiping Bessie's records. The teacher and the inheritor passing on the same stage. The people who watched her in those years did not see a has-been. They saw a woman climbing back. And she was not climbing alone. Somewhere in the hardest stretch of it, an old friend had come back into her life. A man named Richard Morgan, who had done well for himself and now stood steady beside her when the money and the crowds had thinned. He helped hold her up through the lean years with a kind of loyalty that asked for nothing. After all the storms of her earlier marriage, here, late, was something that felt like calm. So let me be clear about the shape of her life in the autumn of 1937. Bessie Smith was not finished. She had lost the empire, yes, but she had not lost herself, and she had not lost the voice. And there were real signs that the worst was finally behind her. She was a working artist with a comeback gathering under her feet and a good man at her side. She was, in the truest sense, on her way back up. Which is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to bear. Because on a clear night that September, on a long straight road cutting down through the Mississippi Delta, there was a truck stopped in the dark, and Bessie Smith was coming up the highway toward it, with everything still ahead of her. The road was Highway 61. If you know anything about this music, you know that road. It runs straight down through the Mississippi Delta, and for a generation of blues singers it was the road, the one that carried them from town to town, gig to gig, all through the country where the blues was born. On the night of September 26, 1937, in the small dark hours before dawn, Bessie Smith was riding down Highway 61 in her own automobile, an old Packard, headed from a show in Memphis toward the next stop below Clarksdale. She was not driving. Richard Morgan was at the wheel. She sat beside him, in the passenger seat, on a clear and moonless night, on a road so long and so straight that the miles blur one into the next. Somewhere ahead of them, in the dark, a truck had slowed on that narrow highway. By the time Morgan understood how close it was, and how slow, there was almost no distance left. He cut the wheel hard to the left, trying to swing around it. He very nearly made it, but the side of the Packard caught the back of that truck at speed, and the impact tore the top clean off the car. Bessie, on that side, in that seat, took the worst of everything the collision had to give. The injuries were grievous. Her right side was crushed, her right arm was very nearly severed at the elbow. I am not going to dwell on the details of it, because she is owed more dignity than that. It is enough to say that the woman with the biggest voice in America was, in an instant, hurt beyond what any roadside could hold. Morgan climbed out unhurt, and in one small mercy on that empty highway, the very next car to come along happened to be carrying a doctor, a surgeon from Memphis named Hugh Smith, out before dawn with a friend to go fishing. Morgan flagged them down. The doctor knelt in the dark beside Bessie and did what he could by the light of the headlamps, and his friend set off on foot to find a telephone and call for help. And then the cruelty of that night doubled. As the men worked to move her, another car came speeding down that same straight road and could not stop in time. It plowed into the doctor's parked car and drove it into the wreck of Bessie's Packard, nearly striking the injured woman and the men trying to save her. The people in that second car, a young white couple, were shaken but not badly hurt. Remember that couple. The story the world would later tell turns on them, and it gets them wrong. 2 ambulances found their way to that stretch of Highway 61 before it was over, and Bessie Smith was taken to a hospital in Clarksdale, the G.T. Thomas Hospital, the one that served the black citizens of that town. There, surgeons did the only thing left to do. They took the ruined arm. But the injuries reached too deep and had gone too long, and there was no bringing her back from them. She never woke up. She had not spoken since the road. Sometime that morning, before noon, in a hospital ward in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the voice that had roared out of a Chattanooga hollow and filled the halls of a nation went quiet. She was, they believe, about 43 years old. Even then, at the very end, no one could say for certain. The same uncertainty that had hung over the day she was born now hung over how many years she had lived. She was gone before the sun was high. But here's the thing you must understand, the reason we are still sitting here together. The hardest part of Bessie Smith's story is not how she died on that road. It is the story the world decided to tell about it afterward. A story that took hold and lasted and buried the truth of that night for more than 30 years. It began within weeks. She was barely in the ground when a magazine article appeared telling the country how the great Bessie Smith had really died. And the story it told was this: that after the crash, she had been carried first to a hospital for white people, and that the hospital had turned her away, refused to treat a dying black woman at its door, and that she had bled to death in the time it took to find somewhere that would take her. It is a devastating story. It is the kind of story that, once you hear it, you cannot forget. And you can understand exactly why it spread. Because it was believable. It fit everything people knew to be true about the Jim Crow South, where a black life was so routinely valued at nothing that a hospital turning away a bleeding woman was not hard to imagine at all. The story felt true. So it traveled. It traveled for decades. More than 20 years after her death, a playwright built an entire drama around that very night, around that hospital door, and put it on a stage for new audiences to absorb. Later still, it turned up in a serious book of American folklore, and by then it had grown in the telling, the way these stories do, until it was not one hospital that had turned her away, but 3. Each retelling drove it deeper, passed from article to play to book. From one person to the next, it hardened until it no longer sounded like a rumor at all. It sounded like history. It sounded like a fact everyone simply knew. There was only one problem with it. It did not happen that way. The truth was finally set down plainly by the one man who had been there from the first moments, Doctor Hugh Smith, the surgeon who had knelt beside her on that highway. Years afterward, he gave a careful, detailed account to the biographer who was trying at last to get the story right. And what he described was not a woman driven from door to door. Bessie Smith, he made clear, was taken directly to the black hospital in Clarksdale. She was never carried to the white one at all. No ambulance driver in the Mississippi Delta in 1937, black or white, would ever have thought to bring a black patient to a white hospital. Everyone on that road knew where a black woman would be taken, and that is where they took her, as fast as they could. So the famous story was false. But now I have to be very careful with you, because it would be the easiest thing in the world to hear that and feel relieved, as though a stain had been lifted off the South. And that is not the lesson here. That is not it at all. Look closely at why the lie was so believable in the first place. It spread because the cruelty at the heart of it was real. The hospitals in that town were segregated, one for white citizens, one for black. And a black woman could not have been treated at the white one, no matter how grave her injuries. That was not a rumor. That was the law of the land she lived and died in. The specific story of the door was invented, but the world it described, a world that decided in advance which hospital a black body could bleed in, that world was as real as the road she died on. The myth was a lie that pointed straight at the truth. And that is the deeper cruelty of it, do you see? Bessie Smith did not only die on that highway. She was taken from us a second time, turned after her death into a symbol in someone else's story. For more than 30 years, the way the whole country understood the end of her life was not actually about her. It was a stand-in, a fiction, laid over the real woman like a marker with the wrong name carved into it. She lay in two kinds of erasure at once. Beneath the ground, a grave with no stone and no name. And above it, in the country's memory, a story that was not true. For more than 30 years, that is how it stood. And then, one summer, two women decided that was not how it would end. For 33 years, the grave stayed bare. There are stories about why. That money raised to buy her a headstone was collected by her estranged husband and never spent on one. That somehow, again and again, the stone that was owed to her never came. Whatever the full truth of it, the result was the same. The Empress of the Blues lay in a cemetery outside Philadelphia under nothing but grass, while the woman herself was slowly buried a second time under a story that wasn't hers. But I want to stop you before you picture that bare grave and think it means she had been forgotten. She had not been. On the day of her funeral back in 1937, something like 7,000 people came to Philadelphia to see her off. A crowd stretching down the street, more mourners than most kings are given. Her death had been front-page news across the country. This was not a woman who vanished. The missing headstone was never a sign that no one cared. It was an injustice of neglect laid over a woman thousands had loved. A debt that simply went unpaid year after year, while her voice kept playing on records in living rooms all over America. And then, in the summer of 1970, someone finally asked the obvious question out loud. A reader wrote into a Philadelphia newspaper wanting to know why the great Bessie Smith had no marker on her grave. That question found its way to two women, and between them, they answered it. One was a rock and roll singer named Janis Joplin, a young white woman from Texas with a voice full of grief and grit, who had built her whole sound on Bessie's records. She used to say she felt like Bessie Smith come back again. She had spent her life listening to that voice. Now she would do something for the woman it belonged to. The other was a woman named Juanita Green, who had known Bessie in a way Janis never could. As a girl, she had done housework in Bessie's home, scrubbed her floors, and grown up to become a nurse and a leader in her community. The star who worshipped Bessie from a distance and the woman who had known her up close. Together, they paid for a stone. That August, a headstone was finally set over Bessie Smith's grave, and carved into it were the words that at last told the truth about her. Not the story of a door, not a fiction laid over her life, but a plain and permanent fact. The greatest blues singer in the world will never stop singing. There is one last thing you should know about those words, because the man credited with writing them, the man who gave her grave its true inscription, was John Hammond. The same John Hammond who, 33 years earlier, had produced her final recordings for $37.50 a side. And the same name that sits behind that first magazine article, the very telling of her death that grew into the myth that buried her. Sit with that, my friend. The man tangled up in the story that got her death so wrong is the same man tied to the words that finally got her right. The one who helped mismark her death helped, in the end, to mark her grave. As though the whole long wrong of it had come around at last to be set straight. The truth had taken 33 years to catch up with her, but it came. The right name, the right woman, carved in stone where anyone could read it. And so we end where she began, not on a highway in Mississippi, and not under a story that was never true, but back in a hollow in Chattanooga, on a street corner, with a poor little girl and a voice too big for the small body it lived in. That voice outlived the crash. It outlived the myth. It outlived the 33 bare years and the uncertainty over the very day she was born. Everything else about her could be lost or mistaken or carved wrong and left to stand for decades. But not the sound. Not the thing she was actually born with. She is still singing. She always was. All we ever had to do was carve her true name over her and listen.